I'm not a climate scientist, but when somebody says to me, "Do you believe in climate change?" Would you want me to? I like you as a human. Sure, I believe it.
My
Okay,
answer
we
is
need you to get rid of your Challenger 392.
I do the
No,
same thing.
I did this with my brother. I had this kind of conversation with my brother because he has a friend. My brother is a great guy. He's got a friend who's highly overweight who said to me, "You're a climate change denier." I said, "Well, you're an obesity kills you denier. I mean, you know that your lifestyle is going to kill you quicker than climate change, yet you continue to eat pizza right in front of me at my brother's restaurant."
Look, let's put this out there. I would say that the word denier used in this context is deeply offensive,
Yeah,
and it is meant to equate questioning the proposed solutions to climate change with being a Holocaust denier.
right.
And
Thank you.
and to me, this minimizes what happened in the 40s to the Jewish people, and I find it deeply offensive. And that the environmental left has been allowed to get away with such semantic, if speech is violence, this is a war crime, and I happen to not think speech is violence, and so I don't want to go too far down that path. But anytime anybody says the word denier to me, I reply back very quickly that this is minimizing the Holocaust, and it's deeply offensive. So I just want to say that phrase couldn't be tossed into the trash bin of our discourse more quickly.
I wanted to say that if we were cheesy enough to
Welcome to the Futures Edge podcast. I'm Jim Miro. As always, the brains behind the operation, executive producer Bob Iacchino, and co-host. Today we have one of our favorite guests, a repeat guest. You all know who he is just by looking at the famous green chicken icon, Doomberg. Thank you so much for coming back.
Jim, Bobby, I mean, I can think of no better way to spend the last few hours before the holidays than having a great conversation with the two of you. A real pleasure to be back.
That's perfect. And what I said to Doomberg right before we came on air is that had I decided to go anonymous 10 years ago, the course of my media career would have been greatly altered. I wouldn't have been canceled, perhaps. I don't know. I'm a little envious, although I'm glad I was canceled. I think it was kind of fun too. But before we go into energy stuff, can we talk about why you left Twitter? What motivated you to do that?
Yeah, sure. Happy to. We left Twitter in August for a very specific reason, which is the new owner of Twitter had decided to not only change the name of the platform, which is fine. It's his private property. He's free to do what he likes with it. Most relevant to us is that he decided that Substack was his greatest threat from a competitive landscape, and all links to Substack articles were throttled, and mentions of Substack would result in your tweet receiving a tiny fraction of the impressions. And look, we're a very small team. We have a finite amount of resources. Part of the magic of the Doomberg experiment has been how small we've stayed. We've not blown up expenses, or we like to joke if we hired 10 people, we might be 20% more productive in aggregate. We're always optimizing, how do we delight our subscribers and what do we do with our limited time? And ultimately it became kind of futile. Just to give you some numbers, at our apex, at Doomberg T is the Twitter handle that we still own, and I still lurk and use Twitter for inbound information as a resource. But at our apex, I think we were generating almost 45 or 50 million impressions a month. And in the 30 days before we decided to leave, we had dropped to like 5 million while still being relatively just as active. And as business people, we can understand why the new owner of Twitter decided to do what he did. We owned the Doomberg brand and decided that our limited resources would be best spent going all in on the Substack platform, I should say. We participated in the author-led fundraising round for Substack. So in full disclosure, we are small equity owners in Substack. And so one could argue that we have a financial conflict of interest, although I would say that this is a relatively modest portion of the combined net worth of the Doomberg team. But we are obviously partners with Substack. We are the number one finance Substack paid, at least in the world, and probably amongst the top 5 on the platform, which is miraculous and amazing. And our philosophy is that we'd rather lose with our partners than win with an antagonist, whatever the motivations of the antagonist may be. So it's nothing personal, it's just business. And it's been actually kind of liberating. We've published at a higher cadence now that, not as distracted with having to maintain a separate social media platform over on Twitter. And we've been doing a bit with Substack Notes, which is, I guess, loosely its alternative to Twitter. And it's been great. And, it's sad, unfortunately. I miss old Twitter, but old Twitter's gone and the world moves on. And so that's why we decided to leave.
I mean, very, very clear. He was the one who forced a decision between Substack and Twitter, and Substack was the more valuable and more attractive to you. That seems perfectly reasonable. Before we move on, because our podcast, since the last time you've been on it, has rolled and rolled, and we get a decent amount of people to watch it now. I think like 6 or 7 people almost. So can you tell those 6 or 7 people? I'm just kidding. We get a lot of people to watch it. Can you tell them where to find you on Substack? Is it just Doomberg you look on Substack?
Yeah, it's doomberg.substack.com. One of the nice things about Substack is there's far fewer imposters. If you just Google Doomberg, you'll get our Substack. And if you go to our homepage, doomberg.substack.com, you'll see a tab called Notes, which you'll be able to go and see all of our posts on their social media platform. There's a tab for Doomberg Pro, where we have, for our Pro tier, our monthly, pretty lengthy presentations that we create, podcasts, so Doomcasts. So when this recording comes out, you'll be able to find it there. We post all of our recordings as well. And so, yeah, it's a great platform. They're great partners. They're not perfect. Who is? We're not perfect, but it all in. They're a great team. It's a really amazing platform. The thing I like about Substack is it is actually changing the way people read on the internet. So the thing that's amazing about Substack is they don't actually moderate content at the platform level. Each author is emboldened to moderate their own. And as long as you stay within their terms of conditions, broadly speaking, and look, we have the comment section to our articles is really amazing and robust, and it's closed to paying subscribers, which by definition means if somebody wants to troll us, I mean, I guess they have to pay for the privilege, and that makes it a little easier to accept the trolling. But by and large, it is a very sort of healthy, the way, I don't know if I'm sure you guys are old enough to remember the way the internet used to be on, message boards and forums, where algorithms didn't proactively put the most outrageous thing in front of you and didn't reward negativity for engagement farming and so on. And look, to the extent that old Twitter was certainly imperfect, Twitter/X, as it is now known, I think it's kind of gotten a little worse in that regard.
I want Bobby with the next question, but I want to know, you realize that Bobby and I are both almost 60 years old. When you said you think we're old enough to remember the beginning of the internet, yeah, we remember when there was no internet at all.
I mean, you both look, a day, not a day older than 39. So what can I tell you?
There was a compliment in that, Jimmy, when he said that.
I appreciate it. Yeah.
I just wanted to take the compliment. Yeah, I think what you just said about Twitter is great, because you didn't say, I hate Elon Musk, his politics drive me crazy, I'm moving to Canada, or anything like we hear about all these other things. I mean, Elon Musk bought the company. He's allowed to do with what he wants with the company, and it didn't fit with what you're doing. That is one of the reasons I subscribe to you, is because what you write and what you therefore represent, which is not poultry, it's reasonable, and you've been very, like, in podcasts I've seen you on and stuff I've read, you've been very reasonable. I saw a podcast recently, and I, for the life of me, can't remember who it is, but you went through your 5 questions that you ask whenever there's sort of an announcement of a new development or a new sort of invention that falls in your purview of physics and energy. And you had these 5 questions, and you went through the questions. I hope you don't expect me to remember what they are, but I remember thinking that they were reasonable, because afterwards you said, that leaves me skeptical because I couldn't get through the 5 questions. Do you remember that by any chance?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. We have a 5-question framework for anytime a technology goes viral in the sort of the mainstream news. But to circle back to what you said about Twitter and so on, look, I mean, you cannot participate in modern society if you only allow yourself to engage in environments where absolutely everything is palatable to you and nothing disagreeable is present. And so, of course, there's unsavory things going on Substack, as the Atlantic was quick to point out in a stupid article last week. By and large, I just think that, as you said, we're pretty authentic with our audience, and one of the magic things about Doomberg is how small we are. That makes us nimble. It makes us quick. It makes us able to publish 6 to 8 pieces a month without having to go through committees to get each piece or each sort of phrase approved. And because we're anonymous, we don't have to worry about being canceled and all of these things. And so as long as we're continuing to be honest with our subscribers for why it is we're doing what we're doing, we have found that they will largely stick by us. And look, it annoyed some people that we left. If you're not annoying anybody, you're not really doing it right. So to your question about the 5 questions, the background on that is I used to be an executive in corporate America with a technology background.
I forget that we know that and we didn't let you explain
Yeah,
that.
that's fine. And I would almost always get an email from CEO of whatever company I happen to be working for with many sort of non-scientific executives get most of their science from the mainstream media. And so there would be an article about, some breakthrough of some battery technology or cure for cancer, pick your favorite, and it would inevitably find its way to my inbox, and I would have to arm them with a compelling series of reasons why this is either safely ignored or something that we need to do something about. And over time, I personally developed this 5-question framework, which we have since incorporated into the analyses when such things happen that we publish. I'm happy to go over the 5 questions real quick for you if you think it would be instructive.
Yeah, if you don't mind.
But this is universal, and frankly, isn't necessarily limited to just science, but it works very well for when we see something hit the wire. So imagine a cure for cancer is claimed, or famously, we used it to assess the claimed breakthrough in room temperature superconductors, which
big day in energy world that was proven wrong.
Yeah,
anyway, yeah.
Yeah, and I think we nailed that one pretty well. But the nice part about this is it gives a framework for everybody to use. So the first question is, who is involved? And look, as we said in the piece, like if MIT and Google co-announce some computing breakthrough, you probably want to take that seriously. But if it's, some university in North Korea that you've never heard of, maybe it's a little less skeptical. And some people will push back. But I do think pedigree matters, like the pedigree of the institution or people putting their names on the line for a big breakthrough claim matters, and you need to look at it. The second question is, where was it published? As a consequence of the sort of COVID stuff, quality of journals and the perceived, pedigree of such journals may have taken a bit of a hit, but by and large, most of the time, if something is published in a big name journal that has peer review, you should take it more seriously than if it's a preprint that no other scientist has seen, which leads to the third question, which is, where are we in the scientific process? If a article is published by a reputable university professor that has subjected itself to peer review and 3 or 4 other high-profile institutions have replicated the results, well, then that matters. And if nobody has ever heard of it and it's very outlandish and it's, preclinical results for cancer drugs, well, then you detract from it. And then the fourth question is, what is the scientific context? And in the case of room temperature superconductors, there's been 25 major claims that have, amounted to nothing. And so it's okay to look at the first 25 when pondering the 26th. And then the last one is, what should we expect next? And so if this is true, here's what we should see. And if this is not true, here's what we should see. And those questions are very simple, very powerful. They don't require deep subject matter expertise, but enough knowledge to know your way around things and a little bit of Google searching. And so we've applied it a couple of times. People seem to like it. We have most recently applied it to claims on the part of Toyota that they have a breakthrough solid state battery that was going to revolutionize electric vehicles, for example. Like those types of questions are really useful for non-scientific executives to get their hands around headlines like that.
Quick question on the room temperature superconducting, because I remember being giddy about it because I didn't use the 5-step critical thinking questions and thinking it was a wonderful thing. Has that been proven to be 100% bullshit or just mostly bullshit?
It has been proven to be not true, and I think the verdict, last I checked, is that the scientists involved misunderstood the data, that there was no nefarious intent. And look, this is very common. Like when you're working on something huge and you believe you've achieved a breakthrough, the human emotions quickly take over. Nobel Prize, billion-dollar startups, and then we have to keep the secret because the Chinese are going to scoop us, or pick your favorite. You think you're being spied on, and I've been around large inventions in my life, both in academia and in industry. Participated in a few myself, not at this scale, of course, but when you think you've made a breakthrough, it's exciting and compelling, and the human fallible nature of humans takes over, where you begin to want to not see the negatives and to focus on the positives. And I think there's plenty of academic fraud in the world, but I don't think anyone is accusing the scientists behind this most recent adventure as knowingly defrauding the world.
All right. So in that vein, then there was a story this morning that I saw. I'm not sure what the original source of the story is. I'm kind of looking to see if it was COP28 or what. But the title of the story was "Another Major Milestone in the Race for Nuclear Fusion," and they were talking about Japan's JT60SA reactor being a significant step toward commercial scale nuclear fusion. Is that one of those times, this particular announcement, I don't know how familiar you are with this reactor, but is that one of those times where the media is kind of just thrown a headline up, expecting an idiot like me to click on it, which I did?
Yeah, not necessarily agreeing with your self-assessment, but
I agree with it. So that's Jimmy
but
does.
but I would say that nuclear fusion falls into a broad category of media clickbait, unnecessary science. So,
and can you really quick, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but can you really quick tell people, because we have a mostly financial audience, just real simple back of the envelope, what does that mean, fusion?
Okay, yeah, sure. We don't need nuclear fusion. Nuclear fusion is purported to solve problems that are already solved. We have nuclear fission. So fission is the traditional way by which we extract energy via radioactivity, and fusion is a ostensibly a quote unquote cleaner way to do that, in the sense that it doesn't create nuclear waste and has far less sort of meltdown risk. Both of those have been so wildly exaggerated in the media by environmental extremists to the point where the general population is convinced that fusion matters. It doesn't matter. It's irrelevant. If we woke up today and nuclear fission was invented, it would be hailed as a civilization-saving technology. It's been around since the 40s. France has been getting 70% of its electricity safely from nuclear power for decades, and if they can do it, surely we could. Nuclear waste is perhaps the greatest canard in the history of propaganda, and I tip my hat to the environmental propagandists, and I condemn the nuclear power industry for having dropped the ball so thoroughly. It is the most made-up, irrelevant, nonsensical point of opposition to an otherwise life-saving, human flourishing technology available. And fusion is a giant distraction from fission. And the moment it actually becomes practical, which is always 25 years away, like Lucy with the football, environmentalists will figure out all manner of reasons why we shouldn't do it. And so anybody who is heavily involved in the nuclear sector, when they see headlines like that, they don't even need to go through the 5 questions. It is interesting scientifically. We would not be opposed to its continued research prioritization, but let's stop claiming that this is the invention we need to save civilization from itself, because that invention has already been made. It was made in the 40s. And it is deployed in not nearly to the extent that we wish it was, but I digress. It is a distraction from existing technologies that could be implemented today. Go ahead, Jim.
No, that's for Bobby. By the way, you talk as much as you want. When you see me do a hand signal, that's for him. People are here to listen to you. But for people who are listening to this, that's takeaway number one. I like our show to have some takeaways. Fusion doesn't matter. We have what we need in fission. And now my question to you is that since we've last had you on, it's been over a year. It definitely seems like governments around the world, the needle has moved more to leaning in and not away from nuclear to fix our power problem. Do you agree with me? Do you think it's becoming more palatable for them?
100%. In fact, we are just in the process of preparing our December Doom Zoom, which is our hour-long presentation to our pro subscribers. And this one is called Coulda, Woulda, Shoulda, Doomberg's readout from COP28. And to give the Biden administration credit where credit is due, the administration gathered 22 of the most important civilian nuclear countries in the world, and they've committed to tripling nuclear power by 2050. This comes not in isolation, but on the back of a complete pivot by Justin Trudeau in Canada, and even in Michigan, where Governor Whitmer signed this crazy bill Within that crazy bill, nuclear is considered clean, basically everywhere in the world except for Germany. And even there, we're starting to see signs. Um, the world has become comfortable with acknowledging that nuclear power is clean energy, it's carbon-free energy. And if we genuinely care about emissions, and we also care about human flourishing, there is no path to decarbonization that doesn't involve a substantial investment in nuclear power. And so, yeah, 100%. And kudos to the Biden administration for leading that initiative at COP28.
Are you telling me I have to give credit to the Biden administration? Because I know I should, and I know it's deserved. It just feels so awful for me. I will if you tell me to.
Let me talk to you about this a little bit. I would think, so coming from the commodity sector, we used to joke that Joe Biden was D, DuPont, like he was a senator from DuPont, and he because for decades that was the biggest corporation in Delaware. And Joe Biden used to know. I can't say what his current mental faculties allow him to perceive, but Joe Biden is a man who understands the importance of gasoline prices and commodities, and he is burdened with this very loud but relatively small minority of environmental progressives on his left flank. And if you actually take a careful look at what Biden has done on the environment, he says a lot of things publicly to placate the far left of his coalition. But in reality, take a step back. The U.S. just set a new record for oil production. The U.S. just set a new record for natural gas production. The U.S. is still producing coal. I think it's top 5 in the world, even though the use of coal in the U.S. is going down. Biden has normalized and stared down the far left on nuclear energy. He approved, ultimately worked with Joe Manchin to get the Mountain Valley Pass pipeline finished. It's not quite finished, but it's basically there. Just approved a new pipeline coming out of Alberta into the Pacific Northwest, so that TC Energy's ample supplies of natural gas can help the folks up there. He has said a lot of stuff in public, and he's, given into them at the margins on issues. But as soon as gasoline prices soared, he emptied the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, which tells you he knows deep down where his political eggs are counted. And I think the grand bargain, which is one of the big conclusions of our upcoming Doom Zoom, is as follows. This is our big readout from COP28. First of all, peak ESG. The crazies have had their time on stage. It's time for the adults to come in. Record fossil fuel industry representation at COP28. Record food and agricultural industry representation at COP28. This, of course, is driving the loony left completely bonkers. But I digress. Here's the grand bargain. The West will phase out coal and replace it with nuclear and natural gas. The global South will be allowed to continue to develop by leveraging cheap coal. We would like it if they did carbon capture and sequestration as part of that build out, but there were no promises in that regard. Natural gas will be proliferated in the West, and carbon capture will almost certainly be forced upon it. Nuclear will serve an important role. And on top of that, we will see a huge crackdown on both natural gas flaring and methane leaks. And of course, methane is natural gas, which is probably 30% of global warming emissions, at least as measured by, global warming potential. And industry, again, another positive development of COP28 amongst the noise is that the 50 of the largest oil producing companies in the world all agreed to radically tighten their methane emissions and to eliminate elective flaring by 2030. These are real tangible things. And then we're not going to cut our carbon emissions anywhere near what we need to get under, quote unquote, 1.5 degrees. And we're just going to roll the dice on that and deal with the consequences as they arise. And then finally, we will still tinker around with solar and wind and electric vehicles and pretend that this is going to make some kind of a difference, which is mostly just feeding the grift train of the people that rely on Washington to pay their bills and could never succeed on their own on sort of a standalone basis. And so that's the grand bargain. They will pay lip service to wind and solar and hydrogen and batteries. But in reality, the methane agreement, for example, is really just a roadmap for how the industry will be allowed to continue to operate for the decades to come. And that's just reality. 82% of our global primary energy still comes from fossil fuels, despite trillions invested in renewables. You could triple renewables and triple nuclear, and we'll still be at 80% fossil fuels. And so that's the grand bargain. That's the adults in the room. And of the leaders in the West, I think the Biden administration actually has positioned itself most intelligently on the issue. Wouldn't be what we would do, but credit where credit is due. He has tried his best to thread the needle, and I think this all derives from the fact that he has spent decades effectively being the senator from DuPont.
So I want to ask you, because I have a little bit of a it's not a pushback, it's more of a question, okay, from my perspective, because I saw people blaming the Biden administration when gas prices were jumping through $4 and $5, and somebody saying California was all because of landlocked and no pipelines, and even though they have about a 60 to 70% higher gas tax than, for example, the state of Florida does, and then I saw people giving credit to the Biden administration when gas prices started to come down. And both of those bothered me for this reason. I recently wrote a Substack piece on mine and Jimmy's Substack where I went through how long it takes from prior to actually securing a lease. So I'm assuming leases were secured, whether that be private or federal lands, how long it actually takes to get crude oil out of the ground through fracking, right? And I found it to be somewhere on the short side to be 2 years and on the long side to be 5 years. And my conclusion was that I wouldn't necessarily give any administration credit for this 13 million barrels that we're pumping right now. And then the second part of that, again, forgive me for the length of this statement / question, was I did not like the dumping of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and doubly I don't like the refilling of it, because I see a future where we need oil. We're not producing as much because there's been no real capital reinvestment until this past year when it started to ramp up again. And it's going to take another 3 to 5 years to get that production back up once it starts to fall off a cliff, if it does. And we won't have Strategic Petroleum Reserve if OPEC becomes aggressively angry. Where am I wrong? Where am I right? And where am I just completely out of my mind?
Yeah, I don't think you're out of your mind at all. And I should characterize what I said, because I spoke with a bit of precision, but there's some context that maybe I could have wrapped around it. Joe Biden's decision to empty the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, I mentioned political. That favorably, was a recognition that it is proof that Joe Biden knows how important that parameter is. And
that is the way I took it, by the way.
100%. Yeah. And I would say that the Strategic Petroleum Reserve was set up at a time where we were desperately dependent on imports. Mm-hmm. And it was meant to provide a certain amount of net energy, days. How many days of net energy do we have in the case with true emergency? We are now net energy exporters. Back to my point about if you take a step back and look at what the sort of combined policies of both parties over the past 10 years, as you correctly articulated, has led to. Don't forget, most of the energy produced in the U.S. is not actually regulated at the federal level. It's regulated at the state level.
That's key, and I don't think I knew that.
And so Texas and Louisiana have a lot more freedom of action than in most countries. In most countries, it's federal and that's it. This is why you can have a California existing next to a Texas in the same country, right? And so there was a lot to unpack in that. But the first thing I would say is the main reason I brought up the SPR was because Biden's tapping of it was the exception that proves the rule. No politician can survive $6 to $7 gasoline, let alone 10, and Biden knew it.
I see.
It was totally political. It was, I think, nakedly political. I think it was proof of failure of the underlying objective of his leftward-leaning, environmentalist plank. But having said that, he was wise enough to do it from a political perspective. Now, whether we refill it, we've been on record saying we won't refill it because when prices were negative and Trump tried to refill it, Democrats killed it in the Senate. So we have what we have. It's far less of a big deal than it used to be when we were massive importers of energy, but the shale revolution has changed all of that. And the shale revolution would not have happened if we were purely regulated at the federal level. Mm-hmm. Let's make no mistake about it. To your question about California, California is unique in the sense that it has no pipelines. And it is the most aggressive towards the remaining refiners that it has. And because it demands all of these specialized grades, no other refiner in the country is willing to, reorient their entire production just to satisfy California. And so you have this situation where I think they have 5 or 6 major refiners left. That's like 90+%. And they're always attacked by the legislature. They're always taxed. Anytime they make any money, windfall profit taxes are threatened. And so why would capital be redeployed? So I would say California is an example where the state leadership has not done what Biden has done. And they're in the find out phase of such behavior.
That phrase.
and so, of course, gasoline in California is going to be more expensive. And if we have a true crisis, California is going to be the first to feel it. And to the extent that the current governor of California has national ambitions, I think this is something people should take into consideration when they ponder who to vote for. But Biden is more practical. And I get it. When the current president is in power, people assume that we are a certain sort of position on the right-left spectrum, predominantly because we've only ever written while there's been a Democratic president. I can assure you we will be just as critical if a Republican were to take charge, because we are ideologues, not partisans. And there's been a few occasions where we've actually written in defense of the Biden administration, for example, during the East Palestine derailment, where the Fox News and Tucker Carlson, when he was still on at the time, were sort of hammering the Biden administration over this event. And we thought unfairly, and we wrote as much. And then that led to a bunch of people unsubscribing and some angry emails and so on. But if you're not true to yourself, then you're just another partisan hack. And God knows that the country doesn't need another one of those.
I just want to add one more thing if I could.
Yeah, okay.
It certainly wasn't. I want to clarify a little. I don't think partisanly about this issue, and I wasn't saying that you did.
No, right? Sorry.
Yeah, and the part. So again, we agree on that point. But I think the part that drives me crazy about just your average person on the street, and I don't have the verbal tact to explain this because I just get mad, like I always do, about everything. But people. Generally, the president is similar to the second string quarterback on a football team who does very little to affect your day-to-day life, and just especially in energy policy, right? And they take advantage of things that were set up in the prior administration, and they blame the prior administration for things that were set up in the prior administration that didn't go well. It's like an ocean liner, right? I mean, a president can't come in.
Correct.
I'm sorry, it's not my podcast.
No, 100%. No, 100%. We have criticized Biden and the sanctions policy in particular. So let's drill down a bit and talk about how I believe we were correct on the failure of the sanctions regime against Russia. We were very early. We wrote a piece weeks after the sanctions were first imposed called Crazy Pills, where we explain in great detail why they were destined to fail. And it took 18 months for the Biden administration to figure that out. I would say only now have they really come around to the thought that the only way to affect Putin's revenue is to flood the world with energy and therefore drive down price. You cannot sanction a major player in the industry's volume without radically increasing their revenue, because as anybody who has spent, it's just insane, right? Honestly, we thought it was we thought it was a joke. We thought it was indistinguishable from parody when we first saw it. And so there have been serious mistakes by the Biden administration. However, to your lament, which we agree with, it's just the nature of politics that whoever is currently in power gets an unfortunate amount of the blame and far too much of the credit when things either go bad or go well. But there is things that can be done at the margin. And look, I would say, for example, you have to give Biden credit on nuclear. You have to give Biden credit on nuclear. You have to give Biden credit on methane. Look, methane flaring, or heaven forbid, even worse, venting, is frankly prolific and unnecessary. Now, you can't demand that natural gas producers don't flare while simultaneously opposing every pipeline project that's on the books, because you can't take that gas from the field and do anything useful with it if you don't have a pipeline to do something with it. And so he will have to stare down the sort of more radical Malthusians on the environmental left eventually. There's no shortage of things for us to write about in that regard. So from that perspective, we're happy about it. But by and large, on energy, Biden has not been near as bad, let's say, as Gavin Newsom, who is angling to replace him. Now, what Gavin does at the federal level, different story.
here's my question. I know that it was asked, but I want a little bit of clarification because I have a little bit of bias that I try to fight as a trader. But one of my theses on investing in oil, and I have the oil companies, and I plan on playing oil from the long side for the next 1 to 3 years. And part of that is because of the lag time for these oils produced, and part of that is because I believe that the fossil fuel industry has been in the crosshairs currently. Do you think that is a viable investment strategy, and do you think that it's defensible?
So we recently put out a piece called Liquefied Natural Glut, and we're working on a follow-up piece, which will probably come out after this podcast airs, tentatively titled Peak Cheap Oil is a Myth. Both of those are related. So we are largely bullish energy in the long term. Between now and 2050, fossil fuel use is going to grow 2 to 3% per year. Everybody who thinks otherwise is wrong. The secular direction of the trend is bullish, but that doesn't mean that you don't have a sine wave oscillating around that moderately upward sloping line. And so, with peaks and valleys with an upward slope. We are headed into a period of significant oversupply in natural gas. And to the extent that natural gas and oil are fungible, that glut in natural gas represents a headwind to the price of oil. I think this is being radically underappreciated in the markets. People we respect, Gering's team at GNR and our friend Luke Groman have a different view, and we've been communicating, at least with Luke offline, to express why we believe there may be some alternative ways to look at the data. Natural gas is burned to make electricity, and so is oil, actually, in parts of the world. It doesn't take but a couple of percent of fungibility between primary energy markets for there to be significant overlap in trend. The piece Liquefied Natural Glut that we recently published talks about how rainfall in South China has been dampening the price of coal in Asia. Well, the price of coal in Asia is arbitraged to the rest of the world, and so rainfall in China is making coal cheaper around the world. And if coal's cheaper around the world, well, guess what? That makes the demand for natural gas be a little lower because they could switch and use coal. Same thing happens with oil. And in fact, we've not yet published this, but I'll give you guys a preview. The thing that is driving down oil because of the renaissance in natural gas is actually natural gas liquids. So these small molecular weight hydrocarbons that are actually liquid, that are co-produced in the Permian, for example, or in what's known as sort of wet gas fields. These are effectively oil. In fact, the DOE just redefined its what oil is for the purposes of tracking U.S. national production, and it now includes natural gas liquids. In our view, anything that gets into a refiner is oil.
Is that part of the 13 million barrels?
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Exactly. Yeah. So that is a new calculation methodology that many oil bulls are convincing themselves makes that number less meaningful. And we would argue, boy, you better be careful. Because once a hydrocarbon finds its way into a refinery, the magic that the chemists and the chemical engineers can do to convert it into gasoline, aviation fuel. And it doesn't mean that has to be done at 10, 15, 20% of existing demand. Look, there's all manner of chemical crackers, and the chemical industry is like 7% of the demand of a barrel of oil. There's these things called flexi crackers that can crack natural gas liquids or naphtha, which sort of comes from traditional oil, and they can toggle back and forth between the two. So all you need is a reasonable channel of fungibility for a glut in one of the primary energy sources to transmit into the others. And so I think anybody who is bullish oil needs to read our piece on natural gas and to understand those interconnections between the markets. There's really those three. There's direct burning for electricity. A lot of it is done in the Northeast in the U.S., unless you think this is some artifact of the third world. But no, in the Northeast, in the United States today, when it gets really cold, upwards of 30% of the electricity is produced by burning oil. You wouldn't believe it, but that's true. It's very when the panic really sets in, they turn to oil. Chemical plants, like I talked about, and then also just you could take, for example, natural gas liquids and blend it with heavy oils, Venezuela, Canada, and make lighter grades. any fungibility across molecules, you have to look at the supply, and the supply of natural gas and natural gas liquids. Qatar has the largest natural gas field in the world. Like, it's shockingly big. That one gas field has proven reserves that amount to 13 years of total global natural gas consumption. That one field alone. It is actually a field that also produces natural gas liquids. And as they invest to grow that field, you're going to get this onslaught of oil-like materials that chemists and chemical engineers know how to convert into the products that we need. And so there's a bullish argument to be made for oil, but there's bearish tailwinds that anybody who is positioning in that space needs to at least be familiarized with so that they can dismiss them.
Is it a fair
takeaway number two? That's takeaway number two, by the way. That's a fabulous point, Bobby.
Yeah, is it a fair thing? Like back in the day when I was being taught what was actually inflationary, they told us example like things can't necessarily be fungible and cause inflation. For example, if steaks gets too expensive, people buy chicken. Actually, I shouldn't say that with you on the show, but yeah, to me is that fair to say with the natural gas liquids? Because actually, Jimmy Tracy talked to us about this. Remember? She talked about the natural gas liquid. So that is something I did not know, is that they were that fungible.
It doesn't take much fungibility to, because again, energy is so critical to the front end of the economy. Energy is life. To say that somehow because our current set of refineries are mostly capable of handling heavy crudes, therefore that'll always be the case. If you get a big enough arbitrage spread, they will invest in the reactors needed to take light and mix with heavy and get the right products that they need. And by the way, once those investments are made, they're there, and that fungibility is forever enhanced. And so the economy is a giant deflationary machine, right? It closes arbitrage. Right now, today, natural gas in the U.S. at $2.30 per million BTU. That's the equivalent of $13 a barrel oil.
Wow.
Just multiply by 6, 5.6. Pick your number. There's a huge advantage to reconfiguring your manufacturing facilities to use natural gas or natural gas liquids, which there's also a glut of. And so eventually, over time, hydrocarbons will be ever more fungible. This is what the economy does. It closes arbitrage. It can't be that oil could trade at 100 with natural gas in the U.S. Trading at 13 on an equivalent basis. What does this mean, however, as an investor? This means manufacturing boom in the U.S. Most people are puzzled as to why we have not yet seen a recession in the U.S. It's not super puzzling to us, despite the spike in interest rates and all this other stuff. We might still have one. The economy is cyclical. But right now in the U.S., natural gas is by far the largest source of ultra cheap hydrocarbons in the world. What economy wouldn't want that as the foundation of future growth? Almost every brownfield site in the country is powered by what are known as cogeneration facilities, where you take natural gas and you burn it and you make electricity, and also you make steam, because industrial grade steam is a critical input into heavy manufacturing. In fact, integrated across the world, the carbon emissions that derive from the production of industrial grade steam are larger than the combined total of personal transportation and aviation. And yet all we hear about is electric vehicles. Nobody talks about this hidden underbelly of our economy at the very front end. And so if the U.S., if you're a fertilizer maker, fertilizer is a globally traded commodity, okay? You get to plug into $13 a barrel oil effectively, but sell your product at $71 WTI or $73 WTI that we see today. That's huge spread. And so you're seeing this boom in manufacturing in the U.S., or this, I tell you what, having ready access to the world's most abundant source of cheap hydrocarbons, combined with engineering and manufacturing know-how in a relatively stable contract environment, is a potent combination for profitability that on a relative basis, it just positions the U.S. to succeed in a global market. And that's why I think GDP has run hotter than most people thought. This is why we're seeing headwinds for oil.
So this is more of I'm asking you this question for selfish reasons. And to put some context in it too, the environment has been an enormous deal for me my whole life. I raised my daughters to believe in that. We've taken them out to Colorado since they were little, leave nothing. And so much so that my second daughter just got her master's in environmental science from Stanford.
Congratulations.
And thank you so much. It was just last week, and she's now going on with some professors to do more and more research. But the question she posed to me is, do you believe in climate change? She said to me. And I said, there's a couple things. I don't believe in the climate change grift because it's obviously there's some bad operators who've gotten control of things. I'm about 70% sure that climate change is real and man-made and depends on us changing our ways. I'm not 100% certain of the timeline they give us, and I question that to the point of disbelieving it. Is there anything that I just said that you, and by the way, you're one of the few people who, when you tell me I'm wrong, actually listen. I really like how reasonable you go out. I mean, because that's not usual for me. Where am I wrong about that?
I wouldn't say that you're wrong. I would say that there's a point of emphasis that I would add to what you said that few people talk about that is often confused on purpose by the environmental left, which is the distinction between pollution and climate change. And I think there's the majority in the middle is very much against pollution. And we have argued in a relatively controversial piece, we need to have government support domestic industry to pay for the abatement of pollution because China is using our desire to have a clean environment against us. They allow their domestic producers to pollute at will, which makes them cost advantage in the global market and allows them to dominate critical material science supply chains that are actually a threat to our national security. And we have argued that the free market fails in pricing such externalities, such as environmental costs and or national security. I could tell you from direct experience, having competed against Chinese upstart companies, that when your competitor's idea of a water treatment plant is a pipeline to the river, you're not going to be able to compete on cost. And frankly, all the big B2C brands that have their great, expos at COP28 could care less, and they just want the cheapest price. And I have been pitching procurement teams in my career about, hey, look, the Chinese stole our IP and they're polluting their local rivers. How can you say this is a fair request for proposal comp when they're basically taking our technology and only doing half of the abatement? And you're telling me that this is cheaper. Yes, of course it's cheaper. And they looked at me and said, well, let's let the courts figure that out. So pollution, different from climate change. And then in the climate change arena, we're probably close to you. We have not really engaged in the direct argument because it's become so hyperpolitical that we've decided to focus our energy on pointing out why certain proposals won't work and the importance of considering all trade-offs and so on. But I would argue that humanity's capacity to adapt to the consequences of climate change is always under-talked or minimized. And ultimately, it is kind of deeply unethical to assume that billions of people should not be allowed to climb the energy ladder like the three of us have been privileged enough to be able to do, out of fear of some potentially negative consequences that we could probably address with some reasonable amount of investment as they arise. So those would be the two things I would tweak. Pollution is different than climate change, and we should be holding industry to account for pollution. But we also have to recognize that we compete in a global arena where other countries might not do so. And so for critical industries at the front end of our economy, I think we need to subsidize them. We need to pay for pollution controls. We need to say it is mission critical that we process our own rare earth elements, that we make our own magnesium, that we smelt our own aluminum, that we smelt our own zinc. Because we can't give all of these things to the Chinese and then wonder why it is we're going to lose the war. Because these things are at the front end of military supply chains as well. And so it's okay at the front end of the government for industry and government to partner. I could tell you personally, the reason why Chinese control 95 to 99% of the three most important steps in the solar supply chain is because they stole all our IP and then polluted like crazy, leveraged cheap thermal coal and slave labor to undercut Western producers and put us all out of business. I was put out of business by these tactics a decade ago. I know what happened. And to listen to all of these environmentalists talk about S-curve innovation and all this other nonsense when I was there, I know what happened. And when the energy crisis hit, what happened to the price of solar-grade polysilicon? It went through the roof because dirty thermal coal was being diverted away from the production of solar panels to the production of electricity in China. Full stop. The price of solar grade polysilicon went up 600% in the energy crisis. it's frustrating sometimes to read that, but that's just the reality of the way that the world is. But I love the outdoors. I'm a big leave no trace hiker camper myself. There's nothing more refreshing than touching the grass, right? To leave the computer and the phones behind and to go out for a long walk in nature and to remember where we came from. And I think left to its own devices, unfettered capitalism would destroy a lot of that. And I think it's perfectly fine. I have worked with many professionals in the EPA and the DOE, and by and large, they care about the country, they care about the environment, and they care about the economy. It's the extremists on both sides that I think that we need to listen to a little bit less.
Yeah, I mean that, and I do have a question after this, but I just wanted to mention that, Jimmy. And having met your wife, I know where your daughter got her brain from. It wasn't from you. But the question itself to me is very similar. When somebody says to me, "Do you believe in climate change?" My answer is always like, "I don't care. Ask me what you're
Clean
asking
environment
me to
anyway.
do about it.
Right.
Yeah, ask me
Yeah.
what you're asking me to do about it individually." Like Doomberg said in the last time we had him on, you first. Like, I just always
First,
respond to
all
that.
the time, dude.
It's
Yeah.
like somebody asking me, "Do you believe it's raining right now?" It's like, well, let me look outside. Yeah, it's raining. But
Yeah.
yesterday it wasn't. So I don't know. I'm not a climate scientist. But when somebody says to me, "Do you believe in climate change?" Well, do you want me to? I like you as a human. Sure. I
I
believe it.
think my
Okay,
answer
we
is
need you to get rid of your Challenger 392.
I do
No,
the same thing.
I did this with my brother. I had this kind of conversation with my brother because he has a friend. My brother is a great guy. He's got a friend who's highly overweight who said to me, "You're a climate change denier." I said, "Well, you're an obesity kills you denier. I mean, you know that your lifestyle is going to kill you quicker than climate change, yet you continue to eat pizza right in front of me at my brother's restaurant." I
Look,
don't know.
let's put this out there. I would say that the word denier used in this context is deeply offensive,
Yeah,
and
it's ridiculous.
it is meant to equate questioning the proposed solutions to climate change with being a Holocaust denier.
Right.
And
Thank you.
and to me, this minimizes what happened in the 40s to the Jewish people, and I find it deeply offensive. And that the environmental left has been allowed to get away with such semantic, if speech is violence, this is a war crime, and I happen to not think speech is violence, and so I don't want to go too far down that path. But anytime anybody says the word denier to me, I reply back very quickly that this is minimizing the Holocaust, and it's deeply offensive. So I just want to say that phrase couldn't be tossed into the trash bin of our discourse more quickly.
I wanted to say that if we were cheesy enough to applaud on this show, we would have done it. My question actually was going to be, and stop me if my first statement is incorrect, to a very high degree, natural gas and coal are fungible for what we use coal for. Correct? Is that
100%.
correct?
100%.
It is. So is it just the lobbies, for example, of like, I don't know, Indiana, Illinois, Wyoming, West Virginia, and the places where that rely on coal for their economy, Kentucky, Pennsylvania? Is it just the representatives of those states that stop the rapid transition from coal burning for electricity to natural gas burning for electricity in order to at least cut back carbon emission?
We've done a lot of that. It's not just them. Coal has one really amazing attribute that should never be minimized. To quote our friend Mark Nelson, if you don't understand why people love coal, you'll never be able to get rid of it. And so let me tell you what that attribute is. You can buy it by the gigaton and store it as a giant pile outside and not have to worry
Wow,
about
that's amazing. Okay.
it. And so natural gas, on the other hand, is accessible by pipeline, difficult to store. Yes, we store it underground in these caverns and so on and so on. But the only primary energy source that a grid operator knows is right there, and it's just a bucket load away from powering up the furnace, is coal. It's a giant battery. This is why Germany, retreated to the coal mines, as we like to say, with the speed and efficiency of the evacuation of Dunkirk. They could make a giant pile of it, and then it really didn't matter what the weather was doing. That is a very, very valuable thing. It lays bare the fallacy of battery backup storage. If you compare the amount of lithium-ion batteries, or pick your favorite battery architecture, that we would need to replicate that capacity, Now, the world's best batteries are hydropower facilities, which is why Norway is essentially like a giant battery sitting in the middle of the EU, even though they're not an EU member state. No country has done their energy policy better than Norway, something we could talk about perhaps at another appearance. But if you do not realize why people love coal, you have no hope to get rid of it. Coal can be bought by the barge and piled up right next to your power plant. And when you drive in the morning, you can look at that pile and know that you have power. That pile is power. If you are using natural gas to produce electricity and the pipeline goes down, or some environmentalist glues themselves to the pipeline and causes a disruption in supply, you're screwed. So, this is a great example that we like to use when teaching the most important word that is desperately missing from our environmental discourse, and that word is trade-off. How does the relative carbon intensity of coal measure up as a trade-off against deep energy security heading into a winter? And until we are adult enough to have such conversations, we won't be able to get an energy policy that optimizes the trade-offs.
You explain things to me so succinctly and clearly, and you have me questioning all the things I think I believe, and I love that, by the way. That's my favorite thing. Bobby, you got anything else? Or no?
Yeah, I just want to say that Thomas Sowell once said there's no solutions, only trade-offs. And I love you ending with that, because the trade-off of getting all the knowledge you give us is we have to be willing to speak to a cartoon chicken. And I think that's a very
you
easy
get to.
trade-off
You
to
get
make.
to.
We get to.
You get to speak to a cartoon chicken.
By the way, is that your real voice, or do you alter your voice?
Oh, it is definitely my real chicken voice.
Okay. And how tall are you in real life? I forget it. Don't even know. By the way, you say you're in the Midwest. There's one big city that, we're familiar with in the Midwest. If you come to my restaurant and to say hello, I won't even ask you who you are. I'll figure it out while we're having a beer. But you can come to my restaurant in the northwest suburbs anytime.
I have a better idea. Go to the restaurant and don't introduce yourself. Because it'll drive Jimmy crazy the next time we have you on, that you're like, I really like the burger and the tater tots were phenomenal.
What location is your restaurant in? What city?
Palatine, which is 30 miles northwest of the Loop. It's an old gangster joint. I bought it 10 years ago, but it was an old Al Capone and the gangster Roger Toohey. It was a speakeasy during Prohibition, and it's been wildly successful through the last 2 years. It's morphed into just successful from wildly successful because of certain things. But if you ever came there, just say something silly, ask to see me and just say, these chicken fingers are sublime. Something like that. And I won't ask you who you are, but I'll know.
Don't let them meet you.
I'll give you some clues. So I know my way around Chicago.
I figured you would.
And I'll be the 6 foot tall, 185 pound, really cut, handsome guy.
Okay, fair enough. And then there'll be two of us, I guess.
I am so looking forward to the day you come on and you go, I just thought the chicken fingers were great, Jim. I sent you a message, but we had to leave.
No, in all seriousness,
damn it.
Hundreds of people know who we are. We've hosted in our what we call the Chicken Coop here, the office that we've built to build up the Doomberg newsletter. We've hosted Grant Williams and Tony Greer and Edwin Dorsey and countless other folks. And next time I'm in the Chicago area, Jim, I will send you an email and I will come in person and I will try the food at your restaurant and I will give it the full and fair review next time I'm on your podcast. And
all I ask. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Hope to see you soon.
Yeah, good to talk to you again, man. Thanks again.
Appreciate it.